Well, my name is Allison Calder, and I'm the chair of UMFA's Organizing and Communications Committee. I'm also a professor in the Department of English, Theatre, Film, and Media. And it's great to see so many people here getting involved, taking ownership. Knowledge is power, and of course, building power is what we would like to do through this and other things. Today is the first of a series of panels and workshops that we're going to be putting on about bargaining, organizing, and communications. And we're really happy to kick it off with today's discussion from our colleagues in labor studies, who are going to be giving us a bit of a primer, I guess, in collective bargaining and what the political moment is like in the province right now, and perhaps what we might expect going forward. Now, I do have to give you, I guess, two caveats before we start. Right. One of them is that this is not a meeting to talk about our UMFA bargaining proposals. Right. So if you're here for that, I'm afraid you'll have to wait a while longer for that as we make our way still through the bargaining survey. So we are not talking about UMFA bargaining proposals today. Instead, we are having a general workshop, a discussion about bargaining in general. And the second caveat I have to express is that the views that are going to be coming from our speakers today are not official views of UMFA. Right, our speakers are experts in their field. They're going to be talking about their research and what they've learned from it and how we can apply that to our own situation. But these are not official UMFA views. So I just wanted to make that very, very clear in case there was any question about that at any point. So in a moment, I'm going to turn this over to Julia to get things going. So the way the agenda is going today, and I think most of you have seen the agenda, it was attached to the announcement about this event. We're going to have 4 speakers from labor studies, each of whom is going to speak for about 5 minutes. And of course, this is 5 professor minutes, so your mileage may vary on that. But I'm committed to keeping this to an hour, max, at the very max. So do keep to 5 minutes, please, speakers. After that, we're going to open things up for questions and discussion. And I'll be facilitating the question part, and to just keep things orderly in that, if you could raise your hand in the participants list, that would be great. And also, please do hold all your questions till all the speakers are finished. It's always, well, I find it anyway more interesting when there's a panel to have the questions at the end, because then we can have some kind of interplay between the panelists themselves as well as with the audience. So I think that will work out quite well for us. So again, we are recording the first 20 minutes of this only, and after that we will be having our main event, I guess. Our discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Julia Smith, an assistant professor in labor studies, and she's going to introduce herself and to get things going. So take it away, Julia.
Thanks, Allison. Hi, everyone. As Allison just mentioned, my name is Julia Smith, and I'm an assistant professor in the labor studies program. I research and teach about union organizing and labor relations, and I'm happy to be here speaking with you today. On behalf of myself and my labor studies colleagues, I'd like to thank the Organizing and the Communications Committee for inviting us to speak with you today. And of course, thanks to all of you for being here. Sorry, I think someone's not muted. Could everyone just mute themselves? Thank you. So yes, thank you to all of you for coming out today. As labor studies scholars, we could happily talk about collective bargaining all day, but we realize that not everyone feels the same way. So thank you so much for taking an hour out of your day to be here. So as you know, this summer, we as UMFA members are heading into a new round of bargaining with our employer. And as Allison mentioned, to help us prepare, it's important that we have conversations about topics like bargaining, so that we all understand how that process specifically works, and some of the key factors that shape bargaining strategies and outcomes generally, and for us as public sector workers here in Manitoba. So this is what we're aiming to do here in this workshop today. So here's the plan. Jesse, Julie, David, and I will speak for about 20 minutes. I'm going to kick things off by providing a brief history of collective bargaining in Canada, and then Julie will explain how bargaining works between UMFA and the university. Next, David will discuss some of the key factors that shape bargaining outcomes, and then Jesse will wrap things up by talking about the current political context here in Manitoba and how it's shaping bargaining for us and other public sector workers in the province. Afterwards, we'll open things up for questions and discussion. And our hope is that by coming together to talk about how bargaining works, we can build our knowledge and power and thereby strengthen our union and our chances of securing improvements at the bargaining table. So just before we get going, a reminder that this presentation, the first 20 minutes is going to be recorded so that it can be shared with UMFA members who weren't able to join us today, but we'll stop the recording for the discussion portion of the workshop. Okay, let's get started. So as I mentioned, I'm going to start things off by providing a brief history of collective bargaining. And I want to start our conversation about history by talking about the present. Now, for many of us, when we think of collective bargaining today, we probably think of a boardroom or a conference room in a hotel. Inside, there's a big long table with a group of workers and union representatives sitting on one side and a group of employer reps on the other side. There's likely a few lawyers there too. The two sides are meeting to negotiate a new contract. There's some polite discussion, some huddled conversations, possibly some yelling if things get interesting. But in the end, proposals are accepted or rejected, and a new agreement is reached and then hopefully ratified by the union membership. It's not surprising that this is what we think of when we think of collective bargaining. The odd time that we actually see collective bargaining in the news or in movies, this is what it tends to look like. And oftentimes it does, and you'll hear from Julie in a few minutes, who's going to talk about the specifics of how bargaining works for us in UMFA. But have workers and employers always bargained this way? And if not, how and why did we end up with the system of collective bargaining that we engage in today? Well, in short, the answer to that first question is no. Workers and employers have not always bargained this way. And the answer to that second question is a bit more complicated. But in brief, the collective bargaining process that we know today came about as a result of workers organizing together and putting pressure on employers and governments. Now, in terms of dates, our collective bargaining system is not that old, having been established in the 1940s, though of course workers had been coming together to demand rights and improvements in their wages and working conditions prior to this. Like other parts of the legal framework that govern relations between employers and unionized workers today, collective bargaining is part of the long history of class struggle in Canada, a struggle that's resulted in a number of rights that we often take for granted today. So for example, just this past Monday was the 149th anniversary of the passing of the 1872 Trade Unions Act, which decriminalized unions in Canada. Prior to this, workers who tried to form unions and organize together to improve their working conditions could be charged with criminal conspiracy. And just like today, even after winning important legal victories, workers still face challenges. In the late 19th century, there were still many constraints on the types of things unions could do, and employers were not obligated to recognize unions. It was only by continuing to organize, continuing to work together to put pressure on employers and governments that workers eventually secured more rights and improvements, including a legally protected collective bargaining process like the one we use today. So as I mentioned earlier, our current system dates back to the 1940s and the Second World War. With a booming wartime economy and people joining the war effort, labor was in high demand and short supply. So workers used this as leverage to secure improvements, including union recognition. After the war ended, workers pushed to protect wartime gains by engaging in a record number of strikes. And as a result, in 1948, the federal government brought in new legislation, commonly referred to as the post-war settlement, that incorporated and enshrined many of the policies and practices it had established through temporary wartime legislation, including granting some workers collective bargaining rights. In the decades that followed, workers continued to organize to demand these new rights be extended to other groups of workers, including public sector workers like us, many of whom lacked the right to strike and engage in collective bargaining. As a result of labor activism throughout the 1960s and 70s, federal and provincial governments took steps to revise existing labor laws. The labor relations system established during and after the war continues to be the framework that shapes collective bargaining in Canada. And while it has provided workers with a number of rights and protections, it has also constrained union activity by channeling labor activism into narrow legal channels. Meanwhile, employers and governments have consistently worked to chip away at the laws that shape collective bargaining and the rights that workers have won over time. We can see evidence of this all around us, whether it be back to work legislation that violates postal workers' right to strike, or the Public Services Sustainability Act that illegally interferes in public sector bargaining here in Manitoba. And Jesse will have more to say about the Manitoba context in a few minutes. For now, I'll conclude by saying that history shows us that workers win when they are part of a strong and inclusive labor movement, one that has a mobilized and engaged membership involving workers across industries, occupations, and workplaces. The history of collective bargaining offers important lessons that we can incorporate into our strategies and struggle for fair contracts here at the U of M. Thank you. I'll hand things over to Julie now. I'm going to talk about how bargaining works for us as UMFA members.
Okay, great, thank you. So am I heard okay? Yes? Is that a yes? Okay, can't see. Okay, right, so I'm going to do a quick overview of the bargaining process after a quick overview of labor history. I think we're all doing this very fast. So most of us are fairly familiar with how collective bargaining works, having been through it 3 times in the last 5 years. And the process itself is fairly straightforward, as I think Julia suggests in her talk about labor law. So under the rules of labor legislation, collective bargaining involves 2 opposing sides. In other words, it's inherently adversarial. That doesn't mean that it has to involve conflict or that both the employer and the union can't reach an amicable agreement. It just means that the law reflects the fact that employers and their employees will inevitably have different interests and different perceptions of fairness, and that even amicable discussions will reflect those opposing interests. Collective bargaining is designed to take those opposing interests into account and help the employer and the union reach an agreement based on compromises that are acceptable to both sides. Strikes happen when the employer and the union are unable to reach an agreement during negotiations. But the fact that strikes are so rare is evidence that the process typically works and the parties reach an agreement that both can live with. Not ideal on either side usually. Normally, when the parties are unable to negotiate an agreement, they can agree to bring in an arbitrator who will decide the issues upon which the parties cannot agree. That's unlikely to be an option in this case. The province has refused to allow the employer to agree to arbitration in the past and has done the same with other public sector employers, including most recently the nurses. The only exceptions at the moment are the unions that had the option of arbitration written into their collective agreements, something that was not an option for us because the employer refused to include it. We tried. Without the option of arbitration, the only option in the case of an impasse is a strike. So one point to be clear on is that bargaining is much more difficult for the union than it is for the employer. The union has to find a compromise that meets the need, that meets at least the minimum demands of all its members. So we have 1,200 members who work in different situations and have different priorities. The employer doesn't have to balance dozens or hundreds of different priorities. For the employer, most, if not all, decisions are about the distribution of resources, mostly money and decision-making power, which for us includes faculty governance. So right from the start of bargaining, the employer knows what they can or believe they can afford and how much they want to allocate to the faculty, as well as how much decision-making power they're prepared to share. In negotiations, the union has to negotiate the best deal possible from the employer while balancing the different priorities of the members. So it's quite different on the union side. The most important work for the union is first to determine as much as possible what the employer is prepared to give on, which is usually not very much, despite what they may say, and to find solutions that will result in changes to the agreement that will be acceptable to both the employer and the members. In UMFA, those proposals and the ongoing modifications to them during bargaining are part of a collective process by the Collective Agreement Committee. Our Collective Agreement Committee is comprised of people who represent the diversity of UMFA members, people from both campuses and from as many different faculties and areas as possible. So the bargaining proposals that we put across the table that we will be presenting to the members very soon are put together by the Collective Agreement Committee. The initial proposal is based on the bargaining survey that hopefully everybody has done, the grievances of the past year or so, and the more than 20 constituency meetings with almost 200 members we've held to consult directly with members about your priorities. So just to be clear, compared to other unions, this is an exceptionally participatory process. It reflects a strong desire by the executive, the Collective Agreement Committee, and the bargaining team to involve everyone as directly as possible in the bargaining process. This kind of participatory process also reflects cutting-edge research in the field that has been proven to work under the increasingly difficult circumstances that all unions are facing. So normally bargaining begins with both bargaining teams presenting their proposals. This didn't happen the last time we bargained. The UMFA team presented our proposals, but the employer's team gave us nothing and essentially declined to bargain. We're hoping that when we start negotiating, which we plan to do very soon, they will be more forthcoming. They may be, because this time the entire collective agreement is being negotiated, whereas last year we could only talk about money. What will happen, whether they share their proposals with us or not, is that the bargaining team will meet after every bargaining session with the collective agreement committee. The bargaining team will give the members of the collective agreement committee an update, and then we will all discuss any changes in the proposals that might move the employer, any arguments that might be persuasive, and any changes in strategy. So again, to be clear, the bargaining team makes no independent decisions. We do only as we are directed by the entire collective agreement committee. The bargaining team then does their best to persuade the employer's team that our proposals are reasonable and necessary, and that they reflect the strongly held convictions of UMFA members. Data helps. Much of the evidence we use at the bargaining table comes from the bargaining surveys and the constituency meetings, which this time will be a much more important part of the evidence that we use to try to persuade the employer. Bargaining team tries to impress the employer that the union's proposals are right and reasonable. And of course, we go out of our way to make sure they are right and reasonable. We also use data based on the university's own financial statements to show that they are affordable. But persuasive arguments alone do not persuade an employer that either A, doesn't want to concede to our proposals, or presumably in our case, is under extreme pressure by the Manitoba government to refuse a pay increase, or indeed any other sort of monetary increase in any area, including benefits. So no money is what the province is saying, and they mean no money. Even if our president and the Board of Governors were willing to agree to all of our reasonable and affordable proposals, persuasive arguments at the bargaining table would not be enough to get us an agreement. To be clear, good arguments at the bargaining table are never enough to get improvements an employer doesn't want to give. But in the present situation, the employer believes that their hands are tied by the province, which has them over a financial barrel. They'll be punished if they do what the province doesn't want them to do, they tell us. So for us to make any gains at the bargaining table, we will need to put so much pressure on the provincial government that they will relinquish their hold on our employer. David Benarash has confirmed that the university believes UMFA members are paid about 8% less than is fair and reasonable. We might disagree about that number, but that's what David Benarash has said. But he and the Board of Governors have been warned by the province that there will be significant consequences if they fail to conform to the mandate issued by the province, which forbids them from agreeing to any monetary increase. So this time, more than ever, UMFA members have a direct role to play in collective bargaining. We all need to use the tools that the UMFA activist contingent has been preparing to mobilize broad support within the community for adequately funded, sustainable post-secondary education in this province. Nothing the bargaining team or the collective agreement committee can do in negotiations can in any way compare to the effectiveness of the collective voice of UMFA members to support this round of bargaining. Thanks.
Hey, I'm David Camfield. I'm an associate professor in labor studies, also in sociology. And I'm just going to pick up where Julie left off. I'm talking about the power relations and the real world of bargaining. So what I'm going to do is just talk a bit in general terms about what determines the outcome of collective bargaining when the dust settles. And then I want to consider two objections to what I'm going to be saying and then refute those. So, when the dust settles, really, we have the outcomes that we have. We look back and we analyze what determines those outcomes. I think there are really three factors, and I'm going to talk about them in order from the least to the most important. The first and the least important, it's important, but the least important is the skills of the negotiating teams. So how skillful is the team? How well is it able to persuade the other side of its position? How well can it interpret what the other side's position is, what their real position is, what their priorities are? Second, the interests, values, and expectations of both sides. For example, how much do union members care about a particular issue, and what are they prepared to do about it? And on the other side of the table, how important is something to the employer, and how far are they prepared to go about it? Then the third, and really the crucial determinant of bargaining outcomes, is power. In other words, the ability of one side to force the other to agree to something that it doesn't want to agree to. And when it comes to people like us in the public sector, we have two key sources of power. The first is the impact we have on the employer by withdrawing our labor, the way that the institution is disrupted when we are not working, or the credible threat that we could actually do that even if we don't do it. Now, there's a complication here, and that is in the public sector, when we go on strike, the employers save salary, they're not paying us, and so they may not feel an immediate financial pressure to settle. The second key source of power for us is our ability to mobilize what you could call third parties to act on our side, to put pressure on the employer. So, for example, students, not just the executive of UMSU, but students much more broadly, parents, and other people in the province, the government, which, as Julia said, is the decisive influence on the administration, can't easily ignore. I want to underline that passive support doesn't give us or any other union power. It's active support that really makes a difference. So a highly mobilized union with strong community support has a lot more power than a union whose members are only weakly mobilized and have only weak community support. And when it comes to that kind of external support, the key here is the kind of relationships that union members can build with other people in the community at a grassroots level. And that's what can be applied to put pressure on employers and governments. So while favorable media coverage and efforts to persuade an unspecified public through op-eds and ads and so on, they're not irrelevant, but they have a lot less impact than the relationships that members can actually build at the grassroots level. Now, what a union does then, I think we can understand, can make a real difference in terms of how much power it has. But the unfortunate truth is that unionized workers often don't have enough power at a particular time and place to win what they want, no matter how just their cause or how logical their claim. But that doesn't mean it can't ever be won, of course. Okay, so I want to quickly consider two objections to what I've been saying. The first is to say, well, really, it's the best rational argument that determines the outcome of bargaining, just like it's the most powerfully constructed argument that's best supported by evidence, which rises to the top in a process of intellectual inquiry. I think this is, first of all, not an adequate interpretation of the history of natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, or anything else at the university. But collective bargaining is not a collaborative process of rational inquiry, whatever it is. That's a mistake. To think about it like that is a mistake that people like us are much more prone to make than people outside the university world. So collective bargaining is not a cooperative problem-solving exercise with people with the same interests trying to find a solution. It's a conflictual process because the interests of the two sides are not the same. So think about how it's, in our case, we want better pay, benefits, working conditions, and rights to enable us to do our jobs as well as we can. The administration wants to restrain spending, have more control over us, to weaken our collective agreement rights, which limit what management can do. And of course, they're also trying to avoid retribution by the provincial government. So while there are issues with mutually beneficial outcomes, those are pretty minor. Most collective bargaining issues are win-lose. And the second objection is to challenge what I've been saying by saying the outcome of bargaining is determined by who's got the most skillful bargainer. And people who take this position would, for example, point to cases where one side really does outsmart the other at the bargaining table and persuade them to agree to something that they didn't intend to, or that they subsequently realize they shouldn't have. So I'm not denying that the skill of bargainers matters, but it's marginal. It's extremely rare for a union negotiator to ever win through outsmarting the employer on a major issue. And it practically never happens about an issue which is obviously major. And if we look at the fact that over the last 4 decades, outcomes in bargaining for unions have been deteriorating, not just in Canada, but internationally, and we think about that, well, if it was bargaining skill that really determined the outcomes, well, what would that tell us? That would suggest that we've had a huge decline in union bargaining skills for 4 decades. So is it a case of large-scale collective senility on the part of bargainers? I don't think that's what's going on. I think the problem is declining union power. So just to wrap up then, the single most important thing to understand around collective bargaining outcomes is that what matters most is power, not the quality of rational arguments in support of positions or the skill of people at the bargaining table. And so for us in UMFA, if we want better outcomes in collective bargaining, what we need to do is focus on strategy and methods for building power. And there's lots of union experience and research that gives us answers about how to do that.
Thanks, David. I'm going to speak on the political economic context in Manitoba. I'm Jesse Hager, an assistant professor in economics and labor studies. I'm going to argue that the dynamics of our bargaining contexts are being dictated by the high-level governing priorities of the current government, as we've heard from others, And I'm going to be drawing from my work with Lynn Fernandez, recently published by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Since the election of the PC government in 2016, its central focus has been on what I would term an austerity agenda. Austerity is an approach to government fiscal policy aimed, at least on the surface, at lowering government deficits and debt. And this emphasis is usually focused on cutting public expenditures. In practice, pro-austerity governments often also pursue tax reductions, even though this increases budget deficits, but this is then used to rationalize further spending cuts. So this has been the case in Manitoba, where tax cuts have been pursued hand in hand with expenditure constraints, as well as along with a tax on workers' rights. Proponents claim that austerity is a good thing, that it's going to increase business and consumer confidence by reducing expected tax burden in the future and relying on more private markets for innovation and efficiency. Critics argue, however, that cutting government spending directly reduces economic activity, and these cuts to government investments in things like infrastructure, health, and education also hurt the productive capacity of the economy. This can lead to reduced economic growth and leave the overall debt burden unchanged. So there's no consensus on austerity, but even conservative multilateral organizations such as the IMF are increasingly warning that austerity can be harmful, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 recession. The progressive conservatives' approach to austerity in Manitoba ultimately led to balancing the budget quite rapidly, according to the Auditor General, by 2019, and again more recently prior to the COVID crisis. But this was accomplished through across-the-board reductions in staff and services. You can take healthcare as a key example. We saw healthcare spending fall approximately 3% in inflation-adjusted terms between 2016 and 2018. Health agencies in Manitoba were mandated to undertake 15% cuts in management staffing, and this resulted in nearly 200 positions being eliminated. Health agencies were also directed to find savings through additional program cuts, amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars. This was all done under the guise of a report by healthcare consultant Dr. David Peachy, released in 2016. Dr. Peachy was hired again in 2019 to assess the implementation of the healthcare transformation strategy. He identified, I quote, a shortage of readily available emergency department beds, a stack up of patients, longer wait times and lengths of stay, workload and staffing instability that was significant and not sustainable. He also noted, quote, a deep-seated unhappiness in nurses and physicians, with nurses more generally facing previously unknown levels of stress, exacerbated by a mixture of unpredictability and under-resourcing. We can also see the prolonged failure in the management of the COVID-19 crisis and the overwhelmed healthcare system as only the most recent examples of how the dominance of an austerity logic plays out for public services and the public sector worker and Manitobans more broadly. The healthcare example is important because the government is now moving on to apply a similar strategy to the education sector. Both the K-12 and post-secondary sectors have seen cuts and insufficient funding up until now, and this has led to a number of challenges, increased burden on students, families, and staff. But it's only now that the PCs are overhauling how education is administered and funded. The healthcare example is important because it illustrates how a commitment to austerity and tax cuts are superseding concerns regarding quality of service, economic efficiency, value for money, and the broader social impacts. I've worked on a number of research projects and interviewed public servants, and we've seen this be the case in other areas as well, where cuts, privatization, and contracting out are leading to serious concerns with respect to public safety and well-being. At the highest level, this government is committed to shrinking the public sector workforce and freezing public sector wages. The government eliminated approximately 2,500 civil service positions between 2016 and 2020, and is leaving a high number of positions unfilled. Crown corporations were given a similar multiple across the board 15% management cuts as the health sector. In the early stages of the pandemic, we saw the government double down on austerity. They demanded $500 million in labor cost cuts from the broader public sector. We saw this lead to, for example, large losses of staff in the education sector, who was already struggling with the impact of the pandemic. The Public Service Sustainability Act, Bill 28, which we've already talked about, has and continues to limit collective bargaining over wages, despite never being enacted and being ruled unconstitutional by the courts. Now, we've seen some public sector unions recently secure some gains in this context of austerity, but they've mostly had to rely on binding arbitration to achieve gains. This required a mobilized and engaged membership, as Julie spoke to, and in some cases long strikes, as well as support from the official opposition to stall legislative changes to eliminate the binding arbitration option. We also see some cracks appearing in the last month in the wage freeze, with some education staff freely negotiating agreements with school divisions that do include wage increases. Just as these gains in wages have required a mobilized union membership, the few examples of successful opposition and reversal of other austerity initiatives, there are few, but there have been some, required significant public opposition to be mobilized. So my key point is that well-reasoned arguments at the bargaining table or elsewhere behind closed doors alone are likely not to get us very far. The record of this government has made it clear that its austerity agenda dominates over other policy considerations. The large deficit increase due to the COVID-19 crisis has been and will likely continue to be used by government to justify further cuts and fiscal restraint. The government, in my opinion, has demonstrated that it will only change course if they're forced to do so through broad and sustained public pressure. We have a strong case, for example, about how we need higher salaries to attract and retain new faculty, the contribution of the university to the Manitoba economy. Those are all good arguments, but the experience to date suggests that this case will need to be taken to the public and backed up by a mobilized, active, and engaged membership and a broader coalition of opposition to austerity if we are to be successful. And that concludes my comments. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, folks.